I was labeling a box of my late daughter's old photographs. I had no particular reason to sort that afternoon, an old habit from grief more than organization, when my granddaughter Sage called to ask, in the careful, confused voice of an 8-year-old trying to make sense of something that didn't add up, why her new stepmother had told her Celeste wasn't really family the way a mom's mom should be. I remember setting the photograph down slowly, my own daughter's smiling face still looking up at me from the pile, right before that question rearranged the entire shape of that afternoon. I had no idea that within the same conversation, I would also learn that my regular visitation time had been quietly reduced for months, that my daughter's photographs had disappeared from the house entirely, and that within the following week, I would sit down with a family law attorney to formalize a legally enforceable grandparent visitation order, one that would make certain no one could ever again decide, without me, how present I was allowed to be in my grandchildren's lives. My name is Celeste Fairbanks. I'm 68 years old. I spent 38 years as a pediatric nurse, the kind of career that teaches you to hear the actual fear underneath a child's confused question, and teaches you, too, that a child's sense of their own family history deserves to be protected as carefully as their physical safety. I remember one particular young patient early in my career, a boy convinced that his own parents' divorce meant he'd somehow done something wrong, whom I spent an entire long shift simply sitting with, letting him talk through his own confused understanding of what was happening at home, never once mentioning to the attending physician how far outside my actual job description that conversation had drifted. Years later, his own mother wrote me a letter, thanking me for being the only adult who'd taken his confusion seriously enough to actually address it directly. I think about that letter often now, in a different light than I once did, understanding exactly how much a child's own sense of their family's true story matters, long before I ever imagined needing to protect that same sense of truth within my own family. My daughter Juniper died 3 years ago, ovarian cancer that moved faster than any of us, including her own oncologist, expected. I remember sitting beside her hospital bed in the final week, her own 2 children too young yet to fully understand what was happening, and promising her, quietly, that I would always make sure Sage and Milo knew exactly who their mother had been. She gripped my hand that afternoon, weaker than I'd ever felt her, and told me, "Don't let them forget the sound of my voice, Mom. Not the sick version, the real one, the one that used to sing in the car." I promised her I wouldn't, and I have spent every day since trying to make certain that particular promise was kept exactly the way she asked. At Juniper's own memorial service, Sage, only 5 at the time, asked me quietly why so many strangers kept telling stories about her mom that she'd never heard before, and I remember understanding in that exact moment, standing in a crowded funeral home hallway, that keeping my daughter's actual voice present in these children's lives was going to require considerably more active effort than simply grieving alongside them ever would. Grief that arrives from watching your own child die slowly teaches you something particular. It teaches you that the ordinary sound of a child's laughter can undo you completely for years afterward, and that you learn slowly to keep showing up anyway, because the alternative is letting that promise go unkept. My husband Desmond, Sage and Milo's grandfather, died 11 years ago, well before any of this began, a heart attack while shoveling snow one ordinary winter morning. He'd spent nearly 30 years as a high school shop teacher, patient with every student who thought they had no talent for building anything with their own hands, and I remember him teaching Juniper to change her own car's oil at 14, simply because he believed every one of his own children deserved that same practical confidence. I raised Juniper largely alone through her own teenage years after that, and I understood, watching her build her own family with her husband Graham, exactly how much a steady grandparent's presence had meant to both of us during those difficult years. Graham Weston, my son-in-law, is 41, a structural engineer, and for the 2 years following Juniper's death, he leaned on me considerably, both of us learning to co-parent Sage and Milo through their own grief while managing our own. I remember those 2 years clearly, Graham calling me some evenings simply to ask how to answer a question one of the children had asked him that day, both of us slowly learning together how to keep Juniper present in ordinary conversation without either of us falling apart every single time. I genuinely believed, watching him during those 2 years, that he understood exactly what continuity meant for these children, which made everything that followed considerably harder to reconcile with the man I thought I knew. 18 months ago, Graham remarried a woman named Ivy Sedgwick, 34, whom he'd met through a grief support group he'd started attending after Juniper died. A group Ivy had also joined following her own younger brother's sudden death in a car accident 2 years earlier. I understood, in an abstract way, that shared grief could genuinely bring two people together. And I remember feeling real hope the first time Graham introduced us, that Ivy's own experience with loss might make her particularly gentle with exactly the kind of complicated family history Sage and Milo carried. Ivy has always had a particular gift for reframing genuine concern for her own new family's cohesion as simply protecting the children from unnecessary complication. My own days, since retiring, had settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm: coffee at my own kitchen table most mornings, an hour or two sorting through old photographs or mending a small tear in one of the children's stuffed animals, the occasional visit from a former nursing colleague looking to catch up. It was by most measures a peaceful life, one I built carefully in the years since Desmond died and Juniper followed him, and one that made an ordinary Tuesday phone call from my own granddaughter feel, at first, like nothing more than the usual welcome sound of her voice. Ivy grew up in a family that valued a clean, uncomplicated household narrative above almost everything else, the kind of upbringing where a difficult or complicated history was treated as something to gently smooth over rather than something to be honestly integrated. I don't say that to excuse what eventually happened. I say it because understanding where someone's discomfort with complicated family history comes from doesn't mean you're obligated to keep accepting that discomfort indefinitely, especially once it starts costing two children their own mother's memory. She told me a story once, early in her relationship with Graham, back when we still spoke easily and often about her own parents' quiet decision never to mention her father's first marriage in front of her older half-siblings, believing it simply made family gatherings feel less complicated for everyone involved. We just never talked about it, and eventually it stopped feeling like something that needed talking about. She told me, I grew up believing that not discussing something difficult was the same as it not mattering anymore. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was a sad way to grow up, worthy of real compassion. I didn't yet understand that she had absorbed an entire framework built around quiet omission rather than honest integration, and that two grieving children would eventually become the people that framework was applied to without their own consent. When Graham and Ivy first got engaged, I met with Graham privately, and we talked plainly about what continuity would look like for Sage and Milo going forward. We agreed, informally at first, that I would continue seeing them every other weekend and splitting major holidays, exactly the rhythm Juniper and I had always maintained even before her diagnosis. I did suggest, gently, that we eventually put something in writing, simply for everyone's clarity, but Graham, still genuinely well-meaning at the time, assured me that formal paperwork felt unnecessary between family who loved each other. At the time, I accepted that reassurance easily. It would take 18 months of careful, creeping erasure before I understood exactly what that informal arrangement had actually failed to protect. I remember the wedding itself vividly, standing near the back of a small backyard ceremony, watching Sage serve as flower girl, genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen since before Juniper's diagnosis, and feeling that afternoon real hope that this new chapter might actually be good for all of us. For the first several months after the wedding, everything felt like exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Ivy speaking warmly about wanting the children to feel loved by everyone in their lives, genuinely including me in small family moments rather than around them. The first time I noticed something beginning to shift was about 8 months in, when Ivy mentioned, almost as an aside while I was picking up the children for my usual weekend, that it might be simpler going forward if my visits moved to occasional weekday afternoons instead, since weekends had become the family's main time together as a newly blended household. I stood in that doorway for a long moment, understanding immediately that she had just proposed replacing 3 years of consistent, meaningful time with something considerably thinner, though I told myself, in that moment, that she simply didn't yet understand what that rhythm actually meant to Sage and Milo. The second incident happened when I noticed during a visit that several framed photographs of Juniper that had always sat on the living room mantel were no longer displayed anywhere in the house. When I asked Graham gently about it, he told me Ivy had simply been redecorating and everything was likely in storage somewhere, and that surely it didn't mean anything more than that. I let the explanation stand, though I noticed on subsequent visits that Juniper's photographs never reappeared anywhere the children could actually see them. Milo asked me once quietly during that same period whether he was allowed to still have a picture of his mom in his own room, a question that told me, more than anything Graham said, exactly how much that particular absence had already registered with him. The third incident happened when Sage mentioned to me, matter-of-factly, that Ivy had asked both children whether they'd be comfortable calling her mom instead of Ivy, explaining it would make their new family feel more like a real family. I asked Sage gently how she felt about that, and she told me, in the plain, unguarded way children have, that she'd said yes because she didn't want to hurt Ivy's feelings, though she still thought about her actual mom every single day. I had to speak with Graham directly afterward, considerably unsettled, to understand whether he'd been part of that conversation or simply informed of it after the fact. He told me he'd been in the next room and hadn't fully registered what was being asked until Sage mentioned it to him separately later that same evening, and that he'd meant to say something to Ivy about it, but hadn't found the right moment yet. The fourth incident happened when I began noticing, in conversations with Graham that I happened to overhear during pickups, Ivy describing the children's routine as requiring considerably more stability and consistency than my own visitation schedule allowed for, framing her own growing influence over their schedule as a necessary correction rather than a reduction in their actual connection to their mother's family. I mentioned to Graham, gently, that I found the growing assumption about my own role increasingly uncomfortable. He told me Ivy simply cared a great deal about giving the children stability after so much loss, and that surely it didn't really matter exactly how she framed a detail that small. The fifth incident happened during a planning conversation for Milo's upcoming school recital, sitting in Graham and Ivy's own kitchen with a family calendar spread between us, when Ivy mentioned, almost as an aside, that she thought it might be simpler if I attended a different, smaller school event instead, since the recital was already going to be crowded with immediate family, and she wanted the evening to feel manageable. "Celeste, you understand, right?" she said, glancing at me with a practiced, reasonable smile. "It's not about excluding you. It's just easier this way." I sat there listening to my grandchildren's stepmother discuss managing my own attendance at my grandson's recital as a matter of logistical convenience, as though 3 years of consistent presence in these children's lives were an inconvenient footnote rather than the very continuity Juniper had asked me, in her final week, to protect. I said only that I'd already marked the actual recital date on my own calendar, unable in that moment to find gentler words that still meant exactly what I intended. The sixth incident happened when Ivy's own mother, meeting me for the first time at a family gathering, mentioned how impressed she was watching her daughter build such a warm, stable new household for Graham's children. "She's always had that gift," she said, beaming for making sure everyone in a family feels equally at home. I said nothing to correct her, the same way I'd said nothing to correct anyone else, though I remember driving home afterward feeling the particular loneliness of being the only person in an entire extended family who actually understood how thoroughly my grandchildren's own history was being quietly smoothed over. The seventh incident is the one I think about most, because it's the one where I should have said something and didn't. It happened when I overheard Ivy mention to a mutual friend, well within earshot, that she'd been gradually helping the children transition away from what she called an overly complicated visitation situation, framing 3 years of consistent grandmother-grandchild connection as a complication requiring active management rather than a relationship deserving active protection. I stood there, having spent every other weekend of these children's entire lives with them, listening to my own place in their story described as an inconvenience being carefully resolved. The 8th incident happened when I discovered, entirely by accident while helping Milo with a school project, that a family tree assignment he'd completed listed Ivy as his mother with no mention of Juniper at all, a worksheet Ivy had apparently helped him fill out without ever correcting that specific entry. I sat with Milo gently that same afternoon, helping him add his actual mother's name properly, watching his own small face light up with recognition rather than confusion once the correction was made, as though some part of him had been waiting for permission to include her all along. I didn't understand, yet that splinters, left alone, don't disappear. They work their way deeper. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment she's disrespected. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. Ivy is just trying to build a stable new household after so much loss. Graham loves me even if he doesn't correct her in the moment. The children still know who I am, and that should be enough. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than accepting that my daughter's own memory and my promise to her had become an inconvenient detail in someone else's more comfortable narrative about moving forward. There was one afternoon, about 2 months before everything finally came to a head, when I came close to saying something. Graham mentioned, during an ordinary phone call, that Ivy had suggested it might be healthier for the children if visits with me became less frequent for a while, framing the suggestion as something a family therapist had recommended in general terms, though he couldn't quite recall which specific recommendation applied to our own situation. I sat with the phone in my hand afterward, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface, very close to finally saying out loud everything I'd swallowed for over a year. Then I thought about Graham's own exhaustion, about how much he'd been carrying since Juniper died, about how a fight over this would only ever add to a burden he was already struggling under. I let the suggestion pass and told myself one more time that the moment to say something hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived long before. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. Then came Sage's phone call. Sage called me herself one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, her voice carrying the particular confusion of an 8-year-old encountering something that genuinely didn't make sense to her. "Grandma," she said, "why did Ivy tell my friend's mom that you're not really family the way a mom's mom is supposed to be? I want you to still come to things." I stood very still in my own kitchen, my daughter's own photograph still spread across the table in front of me, understanding with a clarity that arrived all at once exactly what I needed to do. I told Sage, as calmly and honestly as I could manage, that I would always be her grandmother, that nothing anyone said could ever change that, and that I would make absolutely certain, starting now, that nothing ever got in the way of that again. I called Graham directly afterward. "Graham," I said, "Sage just told me Ivy described me to another parent as not really family. I need you to tell me honestly whether that reflects how the two of you have actually been discussing my role in these children's lives." There was a long pause before he answered. "I think we've been trying to figure out how to build our own family identity," he said, "and I think some of those conversations happened without me fully realizing how they'd sound to the kids themselves." That's not an answer to my actual question. I told him, "Do you believe I am not really family to Sage and Milo?" "Of course you are," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know when I let this get so far, without saying anything. I appreciate you saying that." I told him, But I need to speak with an attorney now, Graham. Not because I want to punish you, but because I promised Juniper I would always be present in these children's lives. And an informal arrangement clearly isn't protecting that promise anymore. I sat at my own kitchen table for a long time after that call, my daughter's photographs still spread in front of me, understanding with total clarity exactly what I was going to do. I called my old friend Winona before I called an attorney, a woman I'd worked alongside for over 2 decades in the same pediatric ward, needing to hear a voice that understood exactly how much a child's sense of family history actually mattered. I told her the whole story, 18 months of incidents, Sage's own phone call, my conversation with Graham. She listened without interrupting, her own tea going cold in front of her. "Celeste," she finally said, "you spent 38 years making sure frightened children understood exactly who was actually there for them. I don't think that principle stops applying just because the children in question are your own grandchildren. I keep waiting to feel guilty about what I'm about to do," I told her. "And it isn't coming. Maybe it isn't coming," Winona said, "because there's nothing here to feel guilty about. You didn't create a complicated family situation. You're simply refusing to let your grandchildren's actual history get quietly erased because someone else finds it inconvenient. Those are very different things, no matter how anyone else wants to frame it." I called Palmer Ashcroft, a family law attorney a former colleague had recommended years earlier. That same week, I explained the pattern plainly: 18 months of gradual reduction, Juniper's disappeared photographs, Sage's own confused phone call. "Celeste," she told me, "many states, including our own, specifically recognize grandparent visitation rights in situations exactly like yours, particularly following the death of a parent when a documented, consistent relationship already exists. What you're describing, an established 3-year pattern being unilaterally reduced without your input, is precisely the kind of situation these statutes were written to address." I sat with that fact for a long moment, understanding, finally, that the law itself had already anticipated exactly the kind of quiet erosion I'd been experiencing. Those first few days after Sage's phone call were harder than I expected. I found myself, more than once, reaching for the phone to call Palmer and tell her to hold off, that surely there was some gentler way to protect my place in these children's lives without filing anything formal at all. I sat at my own kitchen table one entire evening, sorting through Juniper's photographs one final time, trying to remind myself exactly what I was protecting before I let the decision go any further. Each time, I made myself sit with the discomfort a little longer instead of acting on it, remembering Winona's words, remembering the actual weight of Sage's own confused question, remembering that gentler corrections had already had over a year to work and hadn't. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do, because I think it matters. I did not seek to remove these children from Graham's care or to punish him for his own genuine grief and exhaustion. Palmer and I filed a formal petition for a legally enforceable grandparent visitation order, citing the documented, consistent 3-year relationship, Juniper's own death, and the recent pattern of unilateral reduction, requesting a schedule that restored my original time with the children and specified that neither parent could modify it without either my agreement or a court's involvement. We filed that petition through the appropriate family court, with no personal accusation attached beyond what the legal filing itself required, the same plain, procedural language that could have applied to any grandparent visitation matter anywhere in the state. Graham called the following morning, his voice tight with hurt, rather than his usual warmth. "Celeste, a court filing feels like you're treating me as an adversary instead of just talking this through as a family. I understand it feels that way," I said calmly, "but an informal arrangement has already been reduced without my input for over a year. Graham, right up until our own granddaughter had to ask me directly why she'd been told I wasn't really family. I'm not trying to become your adversary. I'm trying to make certain my place in these children's lives can never again be quietly decided without me." There has to be another way to handle this that doesn't involve the court system. There is, I said. If you and Ivy are willing to sit down with me and Palmer and agree in writing to a schedule that actually honors these children's full history, I would withdraw the petition immediately. I'm not interested in a prolonged legal fight. I'm interested in finally having my role in Sage and Milo's lives protected clearly enough that it can't be quietly reinterpreted again. Ivy called 2 days later, her voice sharp. Celeste, this is completely disproportionate. You're taking us to court over a scheduling disagreement. No, I said quietly. I'm the grandmother who watched you spend 18 months quietly reducing my time with these children and erasing their own mother's photographs from the walls they live inside every day, right up until my own granddaughter had to ask me why she'd been told I wasn't really family. I think the real question is what you thought would happen once I understood exactly how thoroughly that erosion had actually gone. I was only trying to help the children build a stable new family identity. I believe that you believed that, I said, but stability was never meant to require erasing an actual, essential part of these children's history. Those are different things, Ivy, and I think some part of you has always understood the difference, which is exactly why you kept managing my presence quietly instead of simply discussing it with me directly. She hung up on me. I sat with the dial tone for a long moment, then went back to sorting my daughter's photographs, understanding that whatever came next would take time to settle. The weeks that followed were difficult ones. Graham called nearly every day at first, caught between his new wife's hurt feelings and a growing understanding of exactly what had actually happened. Winona, once she heard the whole story, offered to sit with me through the initial mediation session, walking me through the process the way only someone who'd spent decades in pediatric care alongside me could understand the actual stakes involved. About 2 weeks after the filing, Graham asked if I'd be willing to join a mediation session with him and Ivy together, guided by a court-appointed family mediator, before things proceeded to a formal hearing. I agreed, genuinely hoping we could resolve this without putting Sage and Milo through anything more complicated than they'd already experienced. When the session began, Graham sat across the table from me, Ivy beside him, her expression carefully arranged into something between contrition and defensiveness. Celeste, Graham began. We wanted to talk through everything properly, figure out what happens next for all of us. I'm listening, I said. Ivy spoke first, her voice tighter than I'd heard it before. I think I genuinely believed I was helping the kids adjust to a new family structure. I know the comment to your granddaughter's friend's mother was wrong, but a formal court filing with no warning beyond what was legally required felt like it was designed to make me look like a villain in front of the whole family. Was that the intention? I considered the question honestly before answering. The intention was to stop watching my daughter's actual memory disappear a little more every month. If it embarrassed you, I understand that it might. It should a little. 18 months of quiet reduction doesn't undo itself painlessly, just because the reason it's ending is a fair one. I could lose Graham's trust in my judgment about the kids entirely if this makes him doubt every decision I've made since we married. Ivy said, her composure cracking slightly. Is that really what you wanted? What I wanted, I said, was to stop being described as an inconvenient complication while my own daughter's photographs disappeared from her own children's walls. I never once asked you to erase her from their daily life. I only asked eventually and apparently not clearly enough to remain a consistent, acknowledged part of it. Graham was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned slightly toward Ivy, his voice low but clear enough for the mediator and me both to hear. She's right, he said to her. We let building our own family identity replace an actual conversation about honoring Juniper's memory for the kids, and I let it happen because I was too exhausted to push back on it properly. Ivy's eyes filled, and for the first time in the entire session, she didn't have a rebuttal ready. I don't know how to fix something that started with me genuinely trying to help this family feel whole, she said. almost to herself. You start by making room for the whole truth instead of a simpler version of it, I told her. Juniper doesn't have to be erased for you to belong in these children's lives, too. Those aren't actually in competition with each other. I'd like that, Graham said. I'd been waiting over a year to hear it said plainly. The mediator, a calm, experienced woman who had clearly guided dozens of similarly painful family situations before ours, paused at one point to observe, gently, that the most common thread she saw in these cases wasn't malice but exhaustion. Two grieving adults trying to build something stable without ever fully accounting for the history already present in the room. That observation landed with both Graham and Ivy in a way my own words hadn't quite managed to. The mediator helped us draft, that same afternoon, a formal written agreement restoring my original visitation schedule, specifying that Juniper's photographs would remain visibly displayed in the children's own living space, and requiring any future modification to go through either mutual written agreement or the court, rather than ever again being decided unilaterally. I withdrew the formal petition once that agreement was properly filed and finalized. About 3 weeks later, Graham came to see me alone, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table. I keep thinking about the promise you made Juniper in that hospital room, he said. I was there for part of that conversation, and I think I let myself forget how seriously you meant it once Ivy and I got caught up in building our own version of normal. He paused, looking at the photograph of Juniper, now sitting again on my own mantel. I don't know when I started treating your place in their lives as something flexible instead of something essential. Thank you for saying that now, I told him. Why didn't you say something sooner, before it went on for so long? Because I kept telling myself it wasn't really about erasing Juniper, he said. It was just about managing everyone's feelings, including my own grief, without upsetting anyone further. I think I forgot that managing feelings and erasing an actual person aren't the same thing. Ivy came to see me on her own several weeks later, considerably more subdued than our mediation session had been, sitting stiffly across from me at my own kitchen table. I keep thinking about how close I came to actually losing Graham's trust and the kids' comfort with me entirely, she admitted, before we'd even gotten to the harder parts of the conversation. I know I have complicated feelings about how this happened, Celeste, but some part of this fear was just about genuinely wanting to belong in this family as something more than a replacement. Of course you want that, I told her gently. I never wanted you to feel like you couldn't belong here fully. I only ever wanted Juniper's actual place in her own children's lives to remain visible alongside whatever you built with them too. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and continued. I've been thinking about everything, she admitted, about how easily wanting my own place in this family turned into quietly minimizing someone else's. I think I was scared, honestly, that if the kids kept actively grieving their mother in front of me every day, I'd always feel like the substitute rather than someone they genuinely loved on my own terms. My own family barely mentions my brother anymore, she added quietly. I think I assumed that was just how grief eventually settled in a family, and I never stopped to ask whether that settling actually helped anyone or just made his absence easier for everyone else to carry. You were never meant to compete with Juniper's memory, Ivy, I told her. You were meant to build your own real relationship with them alongside it. Those are very different things. And I think your own brother deserves better than quiet settling too, if you ever feel ready to say his name more often yourself. She was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly, as though that thought had genuinely never occurred to her as something she was allowed to want. I don't know how to undo 18 months of getting that wrong, she said. You don't undo it, I told her. You start actively keeping her present, out loud, every single time it matters, and let your own relationship with the kids grow honestly alongside hers instead of it. Can I ask you something? She said. Why did you keep giving me the benefit of the doubt for so long, even after the photographs disappeared? even after the schedule started shrinking. Because I wanted so badly for you to be exactly the kind of stepmother these children actually needed, I admitted. It's a very particular kind of hope, watching your son-in-law build a new life after losing your own daughter, hoping the woman he chooses will understand exactly what these children carry. I think I let that hope talk me out of trusting my own instincts for longer than I should have. We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon about Juniper, about the children, about what continuity for them was actually supposed to look like going forward. I showed her a small album I'd put together of Juniper as a young mother. Moments Sage and Milo were too young to remember clearly on their own. A photograph of Juniper singing Sage to sleep during a bad thunderstorm. Another of her teaching Milo to ride his first bicycle in our own driveway, laughing so hard she'd nearly fallen over herself. Ivy looked through those photographs slowly, her hands careful, before asking if she could help me put together a similar album specifically for the children to keep in their own rooms, something they could return to whenever they wanted. By the end of that conversation, something between us had shifted, not fully repaired, but genuinely, honestly begun. Graham and Ivy began seeing a family therapist together that autumn, specifically to work through what genuinely blending a family while actively honoring a deceased parent's memory should look like, something neither of them had properly addressed before. Ivy told me later that the therapist had asked them, in an early session, to describe the single biggest unspoken assumption underlying how they'd approached building their new household. We both said stability, almost at the same time. Ivy said, neither of us had ever said out loud how much of what we called stability actually meant quietly minimizing Juniper's continued presence in her own children's lives. Sage began seeing her own school counselor around the same time, at Graham's suggestion, and told me afterward that it felt good to have somewhere separate to talk about missing her mom, somewhere that wasn't tangled up in whatever was happening between the grown-ups. I called Palmer a few weeks after the mediated agreement was finalized to update her on how everything had actually unfolded, since the family reconciliation had moved faster than either of us expected. Celeste, I've handled a lot of these petitions over the years, she said, and I can tell you what you did wasn't reckless. It was actually one of the more disciplined uses of a grandparent visitation statute I've seen a client execute in 20 years of practice. I told her I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that it had felt, in the moment, more like an act of pure grief than discipline. Sometimes the two aren't as far apart as people assume, she said. You understood from the moment Juniper died exactly how easily a grandmother's presence can slip away once a family starts rebuilding around someone new. The fact that you eventually needed formal protection doesn't make you any less careful for having maintained that consistent presence in the first place. She mentioned, before we hung up, that she occasionally shared anonymized versions of cases like mine with other grieving grandparents who called her office, uncertain whether their own situation was serious enough to warrant a formal filing. I told her she was welcome to share mine, if it ever helped someone else recognize the pattern sooner than I had. Ivy called her own mother that same autumn, correcting, at last, the impression she'd left at that earlier family gathering. Graham told me she'd come off the phone looking wrung out, describing her mother's reaction as a long, uncomfortable silence followed by a quiet admission that she'd always privately wondered whether the children's own mother was being mentioned enough in their new household. She sent me a brief note not long after, considerably more restrained than Graham's or Ivy's own, but genuine in its own careful way. Thanking me for correcting a picture of the family's situation she'd simply accepted without ever asking directly. Sage and Milo spent that Thanksgiving with me for the entire holiday, exactly as our restored written schedule specified. And Graham and Ivy joined us for dinner that evening as well, my own dining room, filled with the smell of a roast and the sound of easy conversation that hadn't existed in longer than I cared to admit. Ivy brought a pie she'd made herself. No elaborate presentation, just a slightly uneven crust she laughed about setting down on my counter. Over dinner, Milo, only 6 but old enough now to have absorbed some sense of what had happened, asked plainly why Grandma and Ivy had been to court. The table went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that used to precede something painful in this family, before Ivy simply said, "Grandma made sure I understood that your mom gets to stay part of every single day of your life, even while I get to be part of it too. I needed her to make sure I understood that properly." Milo considered that answer seriously for a moment, the way 6-year-olds do, before asking whether that meant he could have 2 moms in a way, one who was there, and one who wasn't but still counted. Ivy told him yes, exactly that, and I watched something in his small shoulders visibly relax, as though he'd been carrying that particular confusion quietly for longer than any of us realized. Nobody laughed uncomfortably. Nobody needed the subject changed. A few weeks after that Thanksgiving, a card arrived in my mailbox, Graham's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he'd written only a few lines. "Celeste, I keep thinking about all the months I let exhaustion and a new marriage quietly minimize the promise I watched you make Juniper in that hospital room. I can't undo that, but I can promise to actively protect her place in these children's lives myself now, out loud, without waiting for you to have to fight for it through the courts again. Thank you for finally making certain all of us understood what that promise was actually worth." Tucked inside the same envelope was a smaller note in Ivy's own handwriting, brief and considerably more humble than anything she'd ever said to me directly. "Celeste, I spent 18 months building a family identity around quietly erasing someone I was afraid of being compared to. I'm sorry it took a court filing for me to understand what that erasure actually cost 2 children who'd already lost so much." I folded both notes carefully and placed them in a small drawer beside Juniper's own hospital bracelet, the one I'd kept since her final week. I think she would have recognized exactly what those notes meant, and I think she would have been quietly satisfied that her own place in her children's lives eventually was properly protected. Milo's own recital, the very one that had sparked the 5th incident, took place that winter as part of the restored schedule, and I sat in the 3rd row beside Ivy herself, who leaned over at one point to whisper that she was glad I'd been there to see him get through his solo without a single mistake. It was such a small thing to finally hear her say plainly, and it meant considerably more than its size suggested. Sage's own school recital the following spring included both me and Ivy sitting together in the same row, Graham between us, the whole family present without any quiet management of who belonged where. Sage found me afterwards, still in her recital dress, and told me, with the plain directness children have, that she'd told her music teacher both her grandma and her stepmom came to watch her play, and that both of them had cried a little, which she thought was pretty funny. I laughed with her, understanding that whatever else had been difficult about the previous 18 months, something considerably more honest had finally been built in its place. I saw Winona again that summer, over coffee at the same small cafe where we'd met on our lunch breaks decades earlier, a habit neither of us had ever quite let go of even after retirement. I told her about the mediation, the restored schedule, the honest conversations at my own kitchen table. Winona listened with the same quiet satisfaction she'd shown from the very beginning. "I told you it would matter." Holding that line, she said, "Most people don't have the nerve to actually do it, even when they know they should. You did, and look what it actually bought you. Not just the visitation time back. The truth back." I thought about that phrase for days afterward. The truth back, understanding that it described exactly what I'd been missing more than any restored schedule ever could have. "Do you regret any of it?" Winona asked gently, "the 18 months of silence before you finally acted?" "I regret the silence," I told her. "I don't regret trusting Graham originally, or the family, or even the patience I gave before finally reaching my limit. I think I needed all of it in some strange way to finally understand exactly what I was protecting when I made that promise to Juniper in the first place. I think about that ordinary Tuesday phone call from Sage often. My daughter's own photograph still spread across my kitchen table, an 8-year-old's confused, plain question rearranging everything that followed. At the moment, it felt like the end of something. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something else entirely, a family finally required to reckon honestly with the erasure it had been quietly building. I don't regret the informal, trusting arrangement I first agreed to with Graham. Genuine trust between family members mattered to me then, and it still does now. What I regret is how long I allowed my own daughter's memory and my place in her children's lives to be quietly minimized before I finally insisted the record reflect reality. Real family continuity was never meant to require a deceased parent's own children forgetting her existence in order to feel comfortable, and I intend to make certain Juniper remains an active, spoken presence in these children's lives for as long as I'm able to make certain of it. I think, too, about all the years I spent believing that quiet trust was itself sufficient protection, that a good grandmother simply maintained her relationship with her grandchildren without ever needing anything written down to protect it. I no longer believe that. Trusting an informal arrangement to protect itself isn't sufficient. It's simply a slower, quieter kind of vulnerability, and it costs exactly as much in the end, whether you name it out loud or not. The difference is only in how long you wait to formally protect what actually matters. I think about the specific moments now with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside them. The weekday afternoon suggestion instead of weekends. The disappeared photographs explained away as redecorating. The recital attendants quietly discouraged. Each one seemed small enough to excuse in isolation, strung together. They formed something considerably less innocent, a pattern deliberate enough that I no longer believe, looking back, that any of it was entirely accidental. Ivy may not have consciously planned each individual reduction, but the cumulative effect served a purpose she understood on some level even if she never named it to herself, keeping Juniper's own presence small enough that a simpler, more comfortable family story could take her place. Real family continuity, I've come to believe, was never actually about choosing between honoring a deceased parent and building a genuine new relationship with a step-parent. It was about making room for both, honestly and simultaneously, rather than treating one as a threat to the other. If a family needs a deceased mother's own memory minimized in order to feel comfortable building something new, that discomfort is telling everyone something important, and it deserves to be addressed directly, not smoothed over by quietly reducing the people who keep her memory present. I think of it now the way I used to think about a child in my own care, who'd been told, gently but firmly, not to mention a difficult home situation in front of certain adults. The silence never once actually protected that child. It only taught them their own real history was something to be managed rather than honored. I think sometimes about all those years in pediatric care, learning that every honest recovery depends on a child's whole history being acknowledged, not selectively edited for everyone else's comfort. It took me 68 years and one very confused phone call from my own 8-year-old granddaughter to apply that same standard to my own family. I trusted that informal arrangement freely, and I would extend that same trust again if I believed it would actually be honored. But I no longer accept a version of family harmony that requires my daughter's own children to quietly forget her. If I am the one who promised her, in her final week, that her memory would remain present, I intend to remain the one making certain of it, not because I distrust the people building a new life around these children, but because pretending erasure was ever kindness was never actually true. The family gathers at my own house most Sundays now, a habit that started that same spring, simple dinners with no particular occasion required. Ivy always makes a point now of asking the children, plainly, whether they'd like to share a memory of their mother before dinner starts, a small ritual she suggested herself once she understood what had actually been missing, and Milo has taken to requesting it almost every week, usually some small, ordinary memory that makes the whole table smile. Graham flew in his own mother for one of those dinners that first spring, standing near my own kitchen doorway with genuine warmth on her face, watching Sage tell a story about Juniper that made the whole table laugh. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for over a year. I am 68 years old, a widow, a grieving mother, a retired nurse, a grandmother who still shows up for the children she loves whenever she's needed. But I am no longer a woman who quietly trusts an informal arrangement to protect her daughter's memory, while watching that memory get replaced by someone else's more comfortable narrative about moving forward. That particular version of me stayed behind in an ordinary Tuesday phone call, along with a confused 8-year-old's plain question that nobody in this family will ever quite forget having to answer honestly. I sat down at my own kitchen table that afternoon as one woman, and I stood back up as another, and I have never once wished myself back into the first one. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do anything differently, if given the chance to go back to the day Graham first assured me formal paperwork felt unnecessary between family who loved each other, knowing everything I know now. I tell them the truth. I would trust him again in that exact moment, because his own genuine love for these children was never the mistake. The mistake was assuming that love alone would naturally protect a promise as specific and essential as the one I made Juniper, that 3 years of consistent presence could survive on its own weight without anyone ever formally protecting it. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the trust one extended. It would be the 18 months of small reductions I let slide, reductions I mistook, again and again, for reasonable adjustments rather than what they actually were, a slow and quiet erosion of a promise I made to my own dying daughter. Sage still keeps that small photograph album Ivy helped me put together on her own nightstand, and she tells me, whenever I visit, that she likes looking through it before bed some nights, especially when she's had a day that made her miss her mom more than usual. I found an old recording last year. A voicemail Juniper had left me years before her diagnosis, singing an off-key snippet of a song she'd been teaching Sage in the car, and I gave a copy to Sage on a small keychain, recorder she now keeps in her own nightstand drawer, so the actual sound of her mother's voice never has to rely only on my own memory of it. I tell her, every time she mentions it, that missing someone that much is simply proof of how thoroughly she was loved, and that there is always room in a family, no matter how it grows or changes, for that love to keep being spoken and sung out loud. These days, when anyone asks about the woman in that photograph on my own mantle, my grandchildren answer themselves, unprompted, telling the whole story exactly the way they actually remember it, no details softened, no name left unspoken. I'm simply, finally, exactly as certain of my own place in their story as I always should have been.